Welcome back into the Daily Dose. I'm your host, Jeff Hansen. As always, the show is brought to you by Give'emHellBrigham.com and by CougarSportsInsider.com, part of the 24/7 Sports Network. Thank you so much for your support of the channel. It means the world to me. I appreciate all of the likes, the comments, and all of you who have already subscribed to the channel. You guys are fantastic. Thank you so much. As I've tried to grow this new platform, you guys have helped. You guys have helped impress the algo. That's what it's all about. Thank you in advance for your continued support of the Daily Dose here in the future, and especially as we get closer and closer to the actual season, the content that we've got on deck for you guys for this season to get you through another football season. It's going to be unmatched. Really, really looking forward to it. So thank you in advance for your support of the Daily Dose. If you haven't done so yet, hit the subscribe button so that you don't miss a second of the action. Today, let's talk about defensive metrics and preseason projections. And let's turn to our guy, Phil Steele, to help us out a little bit. Phil Steele, obviously, is the godfather of preseason football, preseason projections, preseason magazines. Not everything that Phil Steele says should be taken as gospel truth. Obviously, it's a projection, but he's pretty darn good at those projections, generally speaking. So I want to talk about what he thinks the end result will be for the BYU defense, according to his metrics and his formulas that he runs to decide points per game and things like that. So he has BYU's defense allowing 160 yards on the ground each game, giving up 240 yards, a little bit more than 240 yards through the air each game, and a little bit more than 30 points per game. So for you math wizards out there, that's more than 400 yards a game and better than 30 points per game. That's not great. And in most years, I'd be pretty concerned because Phil Steele, his formulas are generally speaking pretty darn good. They're not exact, they're not precise, and there's always exceptions. But generally speaking, he gets you in the ballpark of how good a defense will or will not be. This year, I could not care less about Phil Steele's metrics. And there's a lot of reasons why, and that's what we're going to dig into today. And it starts with the players that are on the roster. So last season, I went through the roster and I took out all of the defensive players who were on the team. There were 63 defensive players, regardless of their injury status, scholarship status, walk-on status, it doesn't matter. There were 63 players who were listed on the roster as a defensive player. 63. 30 of those players are no longer on the roster, and we haven't even hit fall camp yet where we get those surprises or those walk-ons who just somehow mysteriously disappear. We haven't seen any of those yet. And that's half of the defensive players that were on the roster a year ago are already not there. So how can you find value in looking back a year or even back 2 years at a defense and saying, this is who they were, these are the players that are back, and this is what they'll be, when you have 30 players that aren't there, when you have half the roster that isn't there? And then you look at the new players that have been brought in. BYU has brought in 26, by my count, new defensive players. There might still be more that are coming, but that's 26 players that are out of the class of 2023 that are joining from the high school ranks. Those are returning missionaries. And those are players out of the transfer portal, both scholarship and walk-on players. And these aren't just players. Like BYU didn't replace a Matthew Criddle with just another Matthew Criddle, right? A guy who's a walk-on and now he's just a number in this statistic. They replaced guys like George Udo with guys like Marcus McKenzie, right? George Udo leaves via the transfer portal, and Marcus McKenzie comes in as one of the highest-rated cornerbacks that BYU has signed in the last couple of years. They replaced guys like D'Angelo Mandel, who were very good, with guys like Eddie Heckard, who have been great during their career. They replaced guys like Jackson Kafusi with AJ Vongphachon, right? I mean, they replaced the guys that are coming onto this roster are better, point blank, better than the guys who are leaving the roster across the board. Obviously, there's exceptions and individual position battles, blah, 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 blah. But largely speaking, the guys that they are bringing on board are better than the guys that left. And you can say that at just about every position. Even the guys coming in off of missions, you're adding a Raider Demooney. You're adding an Ace Kafusi. Those are highly touted guys who had Power 5 offers. And they're replacing players like Isaiah Perez and Alden Tofa. You know, they're replacing players like Hayden Livingston. Those guys are great. They played roles for BYU, but from a pure talent standpoint, BYU is adding more talent. And that's really difficult for me to look at that and not account for that somehow. When you look at a preseason metric and a preseason projection, and you see that kind of turnover with that kind of talent replacing the talent that's leaving, I don't know how you look at that and say, that's pretty much the same as it was a year ago, so my metrics still make sense. You've got to figure out a way to account for the type of player that is being added. So all of this is just talking about the players. We haven't even talked about the coaching staff. BYU's old coaching staff is gone. BYU's new defensive coaching staff is in. But I want to take a look just at a resume standpoint and really understand the experience level that BYU is bringing in that they didn't have. Elisa Tuiaki, prior to his job at BYU, had been at Utah State, Utah, and Oregon State. And only a handful of those years were actually on the defensive side of the ball. At Utah State, he coached running backs. At Utah, he coached on the offensive side of the ball. Up until the last 2 or 3 years, he was in Salt Lake. And then he moved over to Oregon State with Kalani Sitake and coached defense there. So he only had a handful of years coaching defensive football. Ed Lamb, prior to BYU, had been at Southern Utah, San Diego, and Idaho, everything at the FCS level. Kevin Clune is the most experienced coach, or was the most experienced coach. He'd been at Memphis, Oregon State, Utah State, Hawaii, Weber, and Southern Utah. So mostly FCS experience, but he had been at Memphis and Oregon State with Kalani Sitake. Gennaro Guilford, who we love, had only been at SUU, and Preston Hadley had only been at Weber State. Not a lot of experience to really speak of. Now you look at the new coaching staff. Jay Hill had been at Utah for a number of years, and he's been at Weber State, obviously, as a head coach. Gennaro Guilford is still there and brings his SUU experience. Kelly Papinga had been at BYU, Virginia, Boise State. Sione Puha has been at Utah. He's been at Navy. Justin Enna, Utah State, San Diego State, and then a bunch of FCS schools. There's just more experience overall on this coaching staff. These guys have been around the block a little bit more. Sione Puha, in addition to coaching at Utah and at Navy, played for nearly a decade in the NFL. I mean, he's seen that level of coaching. He's tied into the coaching world. The experience level of these coaches is dramatically different than the experience level of the coaches who were leaving. And in these preseason metrics, experience matters a ton when you look at players. You look at returning starts. You look at reps reps played in a player's career, and you use those to kind of determine how effective a player will or will not be in the upcoming season. But we're not talking about the coaching experience, and BYU has replaced not a lot of experience with a ton of experience. It's a different ball game, and this BYU defense is dramatically different than it was a year ago. And because of that, I'm ignoring just about everything that's being said about the BYU defense going into the season. I don't think there's anybody who can look at the past and say, here's my takeaways, and have those takeaways be accurate. We just don't know. This is more than just a defensive scheme that added a new position coach. They are unplugging this scheme. They are uprooting it. They are whatever you want to talk about. It's all new in defense. Jay Hill's new everything on the defensive side of the football. The players are new. The roster looks new. The coaches are new. Everything is new. And I think we could safely ignore most of the preseason projections from the defensive side of the ball. That's not really what I like to do. I like defensive metrics. I like those projections. And we'll get into some of what matters in the future and how we can gauge the success of the defense. But if you're picking up a preseason magazine, Athlon, Lindy's, Phil Steele, whatever, you can probably ignore the defense because there's just not a lot of value in looking back at what BYU's defense was at this point because everything is brand new in Provo right now. Thank you so much for your support of the Daily Dose. And until next time, give them hell.